I'm going to quote my guest here. We've been watching for a while now via various social media platforms and mainstream news outlets the genocide of the Palestinian people. What do the images of a broad swath of Americans, whites and blacks, Latinos, Arabs and Asians, Jews and Catholics and Muslims and Buddhists, shedding their tribal identities and laying it all out on the line to do battle with the aristocrats who are financing the occupation, slaughter, and siege mean to my guest? Let's find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which many of these events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is, again, quoting my guest, when the 99% come together to fight for one another rather than against each other, is the revolution nigh? My guest is a former foreign correspondent for the Washington Post. His work can be found on Patreon as well as Black Republic Media, and his new book is entitled Class War in America: How the Elite Divide the Nation by Asking, are you a worker or are you white? Phenomenal work. Jon Jeter is my guest. As always, my brother, welcome back to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Wilmer.
So, Class War in America: How the Elites Divide the Nation by Asking, are you a worker or are you white? You open the book with two quotes. One is from the late George Jackson: settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done, discover your humanity, and love your revolution. Why that quote? And then we'll get to the second one. Why that quote, Jon?
That quote, that very succinct quote by the assassinated revolutionary George Jackson, really explains in probably 100 words, but it takes me 450 pages to explain, which is that, the ruling class, the oligarchs, you call them what you want, somewhere around the Haymarket Massacre of 1886, I believe, they figured out that the way that the few can defeat the many is to divide the many, to pit it against itself, the working class against itself. And so since then, they have embarked on a strategy of pitting the working class against itself, mostly along racial or tribal lines, mostly white versus black. And it has the ruling class has enveloped more and more people into whiteness. First, it was Italians and Germans and Jews, or Jews really starting after World War II and the Holocaust. And then it was gays and women, and now even blacks themselves have been enveloped in this sort of adjacency to whiteness, where everyone sort of gets ahead by beating up, by punching down on black people. And so George Jackson's quote really sort of encapsulates the success that we, the people, can have by working together. And this, I want to be very clear about it. The enemy is not white people. The enemy is a white identity, right? Hungarians and Czechs and the Brits and the French and the Italians are not our enemy. They are glorious people who have done glorious things. But the formation of a white identity is really the kryptonite for working class movements in this country.
In fact, I'm glad you make that point, because I wanted to call attention to the fact that a lot of people listening to this and hear you talk about the Irish or the Poles or the Italians, that in Europe, those were nationalisms. Those were not racial constructs. Those were not racial identities. And that it really wasn't until many of them came to America and or post World War II that this construct of whiteness really began to take hold as the elite in America understood, particularly post-slavery, that if the poor and the working class whites formed an alliance with the newly freed, formerly enslaved, that would be a social condition that they would not be able to control.
It was as close to invincible as you could ever see this coalition, which particularly after slavery, very tenuously, but many, many whites, particularly those who were newer to the country, Germans and Italians and Irish, who had not formed a white identity. They formed a white identity here. As you said, in Europe, they were Irish, Italians, Germans. One story I think tells the tale. It was a dock worker strike in New Orleans in 1894. I read about this in the book, and the dock workers were segregated, black unions and white unions, but they worked together. They worked in concert. They went on strike for higher wages and I think a closed shop. Closed shop meaning that if you worked in the docks, you had to belong to the union, and they largely won. And the reason for that is because the bosses, the ship owners, tried to separate the two. They would tell the white dock workers, we'll work with you, but we won't work with those N-words. And many of the dock workers at that time had just come over from Europe. So they were like, what are you talking about? He's a worker just like me. I work right next to him, or he works the dock over from me, or the platform over from me. He's working there. So what do you mean you're not going to work with, you're going to deal with all of us? And that ethos, that governing ethos of interracial solidarity was one that really held the day until 20 years later, by which time Jim Crow, which was really an economic and political strategy, had really taken hold. And many of the dock workers, their children, had begun to think of themselves as white.
In fact, I'm glad you referred to the children, because another parallel to this is segregated education. As the framers, and I don't mean of the Constitution, but of this culture, wanted to impose this racial caste system, they realized you can't have little Jimmy and little Johnny playing together, sitting next to each other in classrooms, and then try to impose a system of hierarchy based on phenotype as these children get older. What do you mean I can't play with him? What do you mean I can't play with her? She's my friend. No, not anymore. And so that's one of the things that contributed to this phenotypical ethos separating white children from black children.
Education has been such a pivotal instrument for the elites, for the oligarchs, for the investor class in fighting this class war. It's not just been an instrument, a tool to divide. Education in the United States is largely intended to reproduce inequality. And it always has been, although obviously many people in the working class see it as a tool to get ahead. That's not how the stock class sees it. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, even, it is the investment in education. This is a theme throughout the book, from the first chapter to the last, basically, where education, because it is seen as a tool for uplift by the working class, but by the investment class, it's seen as a tool to divide, and increasingly really since about really the turn of the century, this century, the 21st century, it's been seen as an investment opportunity. So that's why we have all of these school closures and the school privatization effort. It's an investment opportunity. So, the problem is that we're fighting a class war. We've always been fighting a class war, but it's something that is seldom mentioned in public discussions in the media, in the news or entertainment media. It's seldom mentioned. But schools, education, you could make an argument that it is it's the holy grail of the class war, right? Whoever can capture the educational system, because it can become a tool, both by making it, keeping it public, or I guess making it public now, returning it to public, since so much of it is in private hands, by maintaining its public nature, and at the same time using it to reduce inequality as opposed to reproducing inequality.
And education, public education, and access to those public education dollars is also an element of redistribution of wealth, because as access to finance is becoming more challenging, particularly through the neo-colonialist idea using public dollars for private sector interest, giving access to those public education dollars to the private sector is another one of the mechanisms that the elite use to redistribute public dollars into private hands.
One of the things that I discovered in researching this book was the extent to which bonds sold by municipalities, by the government, those bonds are sold to investors. That is more and more since really the Reagan era, because we've shipped manufacturing offshore. So how do you make money if you are an investor? If you've got surplus money laying around, how do you make money? You invest it, speculate. Loan sharking essentially is what it is. One of the ways that you can make money, one of the things that you can invest money in is the public sector. So schools become an instrument for finance, right? And so what we see around the country are schools, education becoming an investment vehicle for the rich, and they can invest in it, and they're paying higher and higher returns. Taxpayers, you and I, Wilmer, are paying more and more to satisfy our creditors, right? And so, as one example, I believe it was in San Diego, or a school district near or right outside San Diego. This was about 20 years ago, but they took out a loan to finance public education there. I believe just their elementary schools in that district. And it was something like $100 million loan, right, just for the daily operations of that school district. And that had a balance due, or the interest rate was such that it was going to cost them, the taxpayers in that district, $1 billion to repay that loan, right? So that is an extreme example. But increasingly, what we've seen is public education bonds that are used to pay for the daily operations of our municipalities are the tool of the class war, are an instrument of combat in the class war, because the more that cities practice what we call austerity, what economists call austerity, right, cutting the budget to the very bare minimum, the more investment opportunities it creates for the rich, who then reap that money back. So they've got a tax cut, right? Because they're not paying for the schools up front, and it becomes an investment opportunity because they're paying for the schools as loans, which they get back, exorbitant interest rates, sometimes resembling the interest rates on our credit card. So a lot of this is unseen by the public, but it really is how the class war is being waged in the 21st century. Speculation, because our manufacturing sector has been shipped offshore, and that's how we made the elites made their money for more than a century after World War II, after the agrarian period. So yeah, it's really invisible to the naked eye, but it is where It's the primary battlefield for the class war.
The second quote you have is Muriel Rukeyser. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. And I know that resonates with you, particularly because as a journalist, one who tells stories. Why is that quote so significant and relevant to this book? And
this book is really it took me almost a quarter of my life to write this book, from the time that the idea first occurred to me to the time I finished, almost 15 years. And it has evolved over time. But one of the biggest setbacks was just trying to find a publisher. And many publishers, I think, although they did not say this, they objected to the subject matter and my characterization. I have one quote again from George Jackson where he says the biggest barrier to the advancement of the working class in America is white racism. So I think they objected to that. But I also faced issues with a few Black publishers, one of whom said that after reading the manuscript, that it didn't have enough theory. I would say that any publisher who thinks that theory is better than story probably shouldn't be a publisher. But I also think it's sort of symptomatic of today's the media today, right, where we don't understand that stories are what connects us to each other, right? The suffering, the struggle, the triumphs of other people, of our ancestors.
The reality of the story.
Yes.
Juxtaposed to the theoretical.
That's exactly right.
In fact,
the application of the theory.
I tell my students when I was teaching public policy that you have to understand the difference between the theoretical and the practical. That there are a lot of things in policy that in theory make a whole lot of sense until you then have to operationalize that on a daily basis and then have it make real sense. Big difference between the theoretical and the practical.
No question about it. And you see this over and over again throughout the book. You see examples of, for instance, the application of communist theories. And I'm not advocating for anyone to be a communist, just that there was a very real push by communists in the United States, encouraged by communists in the Soviet Union in the 1930s to try to start a worldwide proletarian revolution, the stronghold of which was here in the United States. And so the Scottsboro boys, 9 teenage boys, Black boys, who were falsely accused of rape, became the testing ground for communism, right? Now, communism, it was something that sparked the imagination of a lot of Black people. Very few joined the party, but it sparked the imagination. So you found a lot of Blacks who were sympathetic to communism in the 30s and the 40s.
Rosa Parks' husband.
That's correct.
Rosa Parks' husband. Rosa Parks, the patron saint.
Yes.
Of protest politics.
Yes, Coleman Young, the first Black mayor of Detroit, I write about very specifically. It was a thing, right? But it was the application of it, and ultimately, I think most of the Blacks, many of the Blacks certainly, who tried to implement communism, would argue not only that they failed, but that communism failed them as well, right? So again, not an advocacy for communism, right? But that idea really did move the needle forward. And I think, our future is not in our past. So going forward, we might sort of learn from what happened in the past. And there might be some things we can learn from communism, right? But I think ultimately, it is, as the communists say, dialectical materialism. You can't dip your toe in the same river twice. So it is moving, like it's gathering steam, and it's not going to be what it was, although we can take some lessons from the past, from the Scottsboro boys from the 1930s and the 1940s.
You write in your prologue, quote, "I cannot predict with any certainty the quality of that revolution," the one we were talking about in the open, "or even its outcome, only that it is imminent. For the historical record clearly asserts that the nationwide uprisings on college campuses prophesy the resumption of hostilities between America's workers and their bosses," end quote. I'm going to try and connect a dot here, which may not make any sense, or you may say, Wilmer, that was utterly brilliant. I prefer the latter. Just over the past few days, former President Trump has been suggesting using the military to handle what he calls the enemy from within, because he is saying on election day, if he doesn't win, there will be chaos. And he says, not from foreign actors, but from the radical left lunatics. He says, I think the bigger problem are the people from within. And he says, you may need to use the National Guard. You may need to use the military because this is going to happen. Now, I know you and Trump aren't talking. You're talking about two different things. I realize that. Different people with different agendas. But this discussion about nationwide uprisings. And so your thoughts on how you looking at the college protests and what that symbolizes in terms of the discontent within the country, and what Trump is, the fear that Trump is trying to sow in the minds relative to the election. Does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense. You don't say that about Wilmer Leon all that often.
Oh,
but
thank you.
It
You're
makes
right.
perfect sense. But no, and actually, I would draw a pretty straight line from Trump to what I'm writing about in the book. For instance, Nixon, right? Who was a very smart man, and Trump is not a very smart man. It's just that he uses his intelligence for evil. But Richard Nixon was faced with an uprising, a nationwide uprising on college campuses. And he resorted to violence, as we saw with Kent State, which was
yes,
very intentional. With
Jackson
Nixon.
State,
yes, it was
Southern University in Louisiana.
Yes. But Kent State was a little bit of an outlier because it was meant
White
kids to as a shot across the bow to show white kids, right, that if you continue to collaborate with Blacks, with the Vietnamese, you continue to sympathize with them and rally on their behalf, then you might get exactly what the Blacks get and the Vietnamese are getting, right? And honestly, in the long term, that strategy probably worked. It did help to divide this insurgency, that was particularly activated on college campuses, right? So what Trump, I think, is faced with, what he will be faced with if he is reelected, which I think he very well may be, what he's going to be faced with is another insurgency that is centered on college campuses. This time, it's not the Vietnamese, it's the Palestinians, and increasingly every day, the Lebanese. But it's the very same dynamic at work, which is this. You have white people on college campuses, particularly when you talk about the college campuses in the Ivy League, right? These are kids who are mostly to the manner born. If you think about it, what they're doing is they are protesting their future employer. They are putting it all on the line to say, no. There's something bigger than my career, than me working for you. And that is the fate of the Palestinian people. That's very much what happened in the late 60s, early 70s with the Vietnamese. And so, Mark Twain is, I think, perhaps the greatest white man in American history. But one thing he got wrong, I don't think history rhymes. I think it does indeed repeat itself. And I think that's what we're seeing now with these kids on college campuses. That, people thought that they dismantled these these encampments all across the nation during the spring semester, and that when they came back, that it would be over, squashed. That's not what's happening. They're coming back loaded for bear, these college students. That does not augur well for the establishment, particularly in tandem with other things that are going on, which is these nationwide, very likely a very serious economic crisis, financial crisis is imminent, very likely, and these other barometers of social unrest, police killings of Blacks, the cop cities that are being built around the country, environmental issues, what's happening in Gaza, that can very much intersect. We're already seeing it. It's intersecting with other issues. So there is a very real chance that we're going to see a regrouping of this progressive working class movement How far it goes, we can't say. We don't know. I mean, just because you protest doesn't mean that the oligarchs just say, okay, well, you got it. You won. Doesn't happen that way. But what's the saying? You might not win every fight, but you're gonna lose every fight that you don't fight, right? So we have a chance. We got a puncher's chance, right? Like Michael Spinks with Mike Tyson maybe,
right.
But we got a shot.
And to that point, what did Mike Tyson say? Everybody can fight till they get punched in the face.
Everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the nose, right?
Now, to your point about kids putting everything on the line and the children of the elite putting it on the line, there was a university, a Bolt Hall, which is the law school at University of California, Berkeley. Stephen David Solomon, he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that the law firm of Winston and Strawn did the right thing when it revoked the job offer of a NYU law student who publicly condemned Israel for the Hamas terrorist attacks. Quote, legal employers in the recruiting process should do what Winston and Strawn did, treat these students like the adults they are. If a student endorses hate, dehumanization, or anti-Semitism, don't hire them. So he was sending a very clear message: protest if you want to. There's going to be a price to pay.
Yeah, I think those measures actually are counterproductive for the elites. It really sort of rallies and galvanizes people. We saw at Cornell, I'm not sure what happened with this, but a few weeks ago they were talking about a student activist who was from West Africa, I believe, and the school, Cornell, was trying to basically repatriate
them deported.
Yeah, but I think actions like that tend to work against the elite institutions. I hate to say this because I'm not an advocate of it, although I realize it's sometimes necessary. Violence seems to work best, both for the elites and for the working class. And I'm not advocating that, but I'm just saying that historically it has occurred and it has been used by both sides. When any student of France Fanon knows that when social movements allow the state to monopolize violence, you're probably going to lose that fight. I think, honestly speaking, that the state understands that violence can be its most effective weapon. People don't want to die, particularly young people. So it becomes sort of a clash between an irresistible force and an immovable object. Again, that's why I say I can't predict what will happen, but I do think we're on the verge of some very real social upheaval.
Folks, this is the brilliance of Jon Jeter, journalist, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. We're talking about his book, Class War in America, how the elites divide the nation by asking, are you a worker or are you white? As you can see, I have the book. I've read the book. Phenomenal writer. You write in chapter 1, Declarations of War, and I love the fact you quote Sun Tzu, all warfare is based on deception.
That's right.
You write, on the last day of the first leg of his final trip abroad as president, with Donald Trump waiting in the wings, a subdued Barack Obama waxed poetic on the essence of democracy as he toured the Acropolis in Greece. Quote, it's here in Athens that so many of our ideas about democracy, our notions of citizenship, our notions of rule of law began to develop. And then you continue, what was left unsaid in Obama's august soliloquy is that while Greece is typically acknowledged by Western scholars as the cradle of democracy, the country could in fact learn a thing or two about governance from its protege across the pond. What types of things do you see that we still could learn from them, since we're being told in this election democracy is on the ballot and all of those rhetorical tactics?
Yeah,
Wait a minute. Especially in the most recent context of Barack Obama helping to set the stage of a Kamala Harris loss and blaming it on Black men.
Yeah, and that's exactly what he's doing. He's setting us up to be the scapegoats. Does my connecting the dots there, does that make sense? It makes perfect sense. Okay. And I, one of the themes of this book that I guess I didn't want to hammer home too much because it makes me sound too patriotic. But in one sense, what I'm writing about when I talk about the class war, what I'm writing about is this system of racial capitalism, right? Capitalism is exploitive. Racial capitalism pits the workers against each other by creating a super exploited class. That would be African Americans, and turning one half of the working class against the other half, or actually in the case of the United States, probably 70% against 30%, something like that anyway. But the antidote to racial capitalism is racial solidarity, right? Which is a system of governance in which Black men are fit to participate in. Because we tend to be, Black men and Black women, tend to be the most progressive actors, political actors in the United States. The vanguard of the revolution, really, when we've had revolution in this country, we've been leaders of that revolution. And so what I was really trying to lay out with that first chapter, where I talk about this interracial coalition in Virginia in the late 1870s, early 1880s, is that, this was a century before South Africa created the Rainbow Nation, right? Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation, which didn't produce the results that the United
There was
States
no pot of gold. There was no pot of gold.
Not so far. We've seen no sight of it. And Brazil hadn't even freed its slaves when this readjuster party emerged in Virginia. And so what I'm saying is that this interracial coalition that we saw most prominently in Virginia, but really all across the nation, we saw these interracial coalitions, political coalitions were all across the Confederacy after the Civil War, and they had varying degrees of success in redistributing wealth from rich to poor, rich to working class. But the point is that no country has really seen such a dynamic interracial rainbow coalition or racial democracy such as we've seen here in the United States, both in that period after the Civil War and also in the period between, say, I would say, FDR's election as president in 1930, was that 31? 33. 33. So roughly about the time of Ronald Reagan, we saw, of course there was racism. We didn't end racism, right? But there was this tenuous collaboration between white and Black workers that redistributed wealth so that by 1973, at the height of it, the working class wages accounted for more than half of GDP. Now it's about 58%. 42% that the workers' wages account for GDP. So the point I'm making, really is that this racial democracy has served the working class very well in the United States, and by dissipating that racial democracy, it has served the elites very well. So Barack Obama's plea to Black men, which is really, quite frankly, aimed at white men, showing them, hey, I've got them under control. That's his job, right? Is to sort of quell this uprising by Black men. And he's trying to plead with Black men to vote for Kamala Harris, knowing that the Democratic Party, particularly since 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected, has not only done nothing for Black men, but in fact has sought to compete for white suburban voters, i.e., many of them racist, right? Has sought to compete with the GOP for white suburban voters by showing they can be just as hard on Black people as the GOP. People think that the 1995, was it 1994 omnibus crime bill, that 94. The racial disparities were sort of unintended consequences. They weren't unintended at all. They were, in fact, the point. They wanted to show white people, the Democratic Party, Bill Clinton, our current president, Joe Biden, and many other whites in the Democratic Party want to show whites, no. We got these Negroes in check. We can keep them in control just like the GOP can. And that continues to be the unofficial, unstated policy today, which is why Kamala Harris says, I'm not going to do anything especially for Black people. It's why, for instance, nothing has changed legislatively since George Floyd was lynched before our eyes 4 years ago.
Mhm.
Absolutely nothing has changed. That's not an accident. That is by design. So there's some very real connections that can be made. There's a straight line that can be made from the Readjuster Party in Virginia in the 1880s, which had some real successes in redistributing wealth from rich to the workers and to the poor, and it was an interracial collaboration, to Barack Obama appearing, pleading with Black men to come vote for Kamala Harris, despite the fact she's done nothing for Black men or for Black people.
And to your earlier point, offering nothing but rhetoric, the opportunity economy, where everybody will. What in the world is? How does that feed the bulldog? So we've gone from, at least in terms of what they're, I believe, trying to do with Black politics, we've gone from a politics of demand. We've gone from a politics of accountability to just a politics of promises, and
Yes.
very, very vague.
Yes.
And this isn't in any way, shape, or form trying to convince people that Donald Trump is any better. That no, that's not what this conversation is about. But it's about former President Obama coming to a podium and telling Black men, admonishing Black men, how dare you consider this? But my question is, well, what are the specific policies that Vice President Harris is offering that she can also pass and pay for that are going to benefit the community? Because that's what this is supposed to be about.
Yeah.
Policy output.
Yeah. And that's the one thing that's not going to happen until we, the working class, we, the people, decide, and I don't know what the answer is going to be, if it's going to be a third party, if it's going to be us taking control of the Democratic Party at the grassroots level. I don't know what it's going to be, but the philosophical underpinnings of both political parties is Black suffering, right? Black suffering is what greases the political wheel, the economic wheel in the United States. The idea that you can isolate Blacks and our suffering, right? What Reagan did, what Reagan began, was a system of punishing Blacks in the workplace, shipping those jobs overseas, right? Which Reagan began, and very, very slowly. Clinton is the one who really picked up the pace.
The deindustrialization of America.
The deindustrialization of America was based on Black suffering. We were the first. Was the last hired, first fired, right? Right. So we were the ones who lost those jobs initially, and that it just snowballed, right? We lost those jobs. And think about when we saw the crack epidemic. Crack is a reflection of crises, right? Yes. Social crises. So we saw this thing snowball, really, right? But it's you can in their mind. You can isolate the suffering until you can. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have just a very basic understanding of the economy, you understand that if you rob 13% of your population of buying power, you've robbed everybody of buying power, right? I mean, who's going to buy, your goods and services if we no longer have buying power, right? We don't have jobs that pay good wages. We have loans that we can't repay. How does that sustain a workable economy? And people, maybe no one will remember this, but you've probably heard of Henry Ford's policy of $5 a day. That was intended to sustain the economy with buying power.
So that his workers, his assembly line automobile workers could afford to buy the product they were making. There are those who will argue that one of the motivations for ending slavery was the elite the industrialists looked at this entire population of people and said, these can be consumers. These people are a drag on the economy.
Right.
If we free them, they can become consumers.
Right. You don't have to be a communist to understand, right, that capitalism at its best, it can work. for a long time, for a sustained period of time, it can work very well for a majority of the people if the consumers have buying power, right? We don't have that anymore. We're a nation of borrowers, right?
It's the greed of the capitalists that makes capitalism consumptive. And there's another, the Leviathan, all of that stuff.
Yes, and again, Black suffering is at the root of this nation's failure, right? We have plunged into this dark hole because they sought first to short circuit our income, our resources, right? But it's affected the entire economy, right? And the only way to rebuild it, right, if you want to rebuild a capitalist economy, and that's fine with me, right? The only way you can rebuild is to restore buying power for a majority of the Americans, as we saw during the 40s, the 50s, particularly after the war. We saw this surge in buying power, which created, by the way, the greatest achievement of the industrial age, which was the American middle class, right? And that was predicated, again, on racial democracy, Blacks participating in the democracy.
You mentioned Black men and women tended to be incredibly progressive, and that Black men and women were the vanguard of the revolution. What then is the problem with so many of our Black institutions that, particularly when you look at our HBCUs, that make so many of them anything but progressive?
Yeah, that's a real theme of the book. This thing called racial capitalism has survived by peeling off more and more people. First it was the people who came through Ellis Island, Europeans, Central Europeans, Hungarians, Czechs, right? And I have someone in the book I'm quoting, I think David Rodiger, the labor historian, famous labor historian, where he quoted a Serbian immigrant, I think, in like the early 1900s, saying the first thing you learn is that you don't want to be, that the Blacks don't get a fair chance, meaning that you don't want to be anything like them. You don't want to associate with them, right? And that was a very powerful thing, this indoctrination, right? What they do, they peel off one layer after another. One of the most important chapters in the book, I think, was the one that begins with the execution of the Rosenbergs. Who were the Rosenbergs? Ethel and Julius Rosenbergs were communists, or at least former communists, who probably did, certainly Julius probably did help to pass nuclear technology to the Soviet Union in the late 40s, early 50s. It probably, at best, it probably sped up the Russians, Soviet Union's ability to develop the bomb, sped up by a year, basically. That's the best that it did, right? So they had this technology already. Ethel Rosenberg may have typed up the notes. That's all she probably did. And anyway, the state, the government, the U.S. government, wanted to make an example out of them. And so they executed them. And they executed Ethel Rosenberg. They wanted her to turn against her husband, right, which would have been turning against her country, her countrymen, right? She realized that she wouldn't do it. I can tell you, Ethel Rosenberg was every bit as hard as Tupac. She was a bad woman.
But was she as hard as Biggie?
I don't know. I don't know. That whole East Coast, West Coast thing, I don't know. But that was a turning point in the class war, because what it was intended to do, or among the things it was intended to do, was the Jews were coming out of the Holocaust. The Jews were probably, not probably, they certainly were the greatest ally of Blacks. Many of the communists who helped the Scottsboro Boys in the 1930s, and they were communists. Many of them were Jews, right? It was no question about it, because the Jews didn't see themselves as white. Remember, Hitler attacked them because they were non-white, because they were communists, right? That's why he attacked them, and that was certainly true here, where there was a very real collusion between Jewish communists and Blacks. And it was meant, this execution of the Rosenbergs was meant to send a signal to the working class, to the Jewish community especially. You can continue to F around with these people if you want, right?
You'll wind up like them.
Yeah. And at the same time, you think right after the Rosenbergs execution, this figure emerged named Milton Friedman, right? Milton Friedman, who said, hey, wait a minute, this whole brown versus board education, you don't have to like succumb to that. White people, you can send your kids to their own schools or private schools, and make the state pay for it, right? So very calculated move where the Jews became white, basically. Not all of them, right? You still have, and you still have today, as we see with the protests against Israel. The Jewish community is still very progressive, has a very progressive wing, and are still our allies in a lot of ways. But many of them chose to be white. The same thing has happened, ironically, with Black people, right? There is a segment of the population that's represented by our former president, Barack Obama, by Kamala Harris, by the entire Congressional Black Caucus, that has been offered, that has been extended this sort of olive branch of prosperity, right? If you help us keep these Negroes down, you can have some of this too, right? Like the scene in Trading Places where Eddie Murphy is released from jail. He's sitting in the back seat with these two brothers, doctors, right? And they're like, well, you can go home if you want to. And he's got the cigar and the snifter of cognac. No, I believe I can hang out with you fellas a little bit longer, right? That's what you see happening now with a lot of Black people, particularly the Black elite, where they say, no, I think I can hang out with you a little bit longer. And so they've turned against us.
Tom Porter calls that the near position.
Yes.
And for those that may not hear, the NER, the near position. Yes. That Mortimer and what was the other brother's name? I can't remember. I can see their faces. Right. That they have been induced and they have been brought into this sense of entitlement because they are near positions of power. And I think a perfect example of that is the latest election in New York and in St. Louis, where you've had where AIPAC bragged publicly, we're going to invest $100 million into these Democratic primary elections, and we are going to unseat those who we believe to be too progressive, anti-Israel. And Cori Bush in St. Louis and Bowman, Jamal Bowman in New York were two of the most notable victims of that. And I was just having this conversation with Tom earlier today, and that is that nobody seemed to complain. I don't remember the Black Caucus, anybody in the Black Caucus coming out. That article came out, I want to say, in April of this year, and they did not say a mumbling word about, what do you mean you're about to interfere in our election? Yeah. But after Cori Bush lost, now she's out there talking about, AIPAC, I'm coming after your village. Hey, homegirl, that's a little bit of aggression, a whole lot too late. You just got knocked out. Yeah. You just got knocked the F out. You're laying on the canvas. The crowd's headed to the exits. Right. And you're looking around screaming, who hit me? Who hit me? Who hit me? That anger should have been on the front end talking about, oh, you all gonna put in 100 million? Well, we gonna get 100,000,001 votes. Yeah. And it should have been exposed. Had it been exposed for what it was, they'd still be in office. And to that point, and this is very interesting. Now, Jamal Bowman, I talked to some Black activists in New York in his district, right? And they would tell you, we never saw him, right? We have these press conferences where we're protesting police violence under Mayor Eric Adams, another Black, Vichy Black politician. And we never saw him. He didn't participate. In fact, one of them says, she's with Black Lives Matter, I believe. She says, we called him when it was announced that AIPAC was backing this candidate. He said, what can we do? Said they never heard back, right? Cori Bush, to her credit, is more from the movement. She was a product of Michael Brown. My guess is she will be back. Right, that's my guess, because she has a lot of support from the grassroots. She probably, if anyone can defeat AIPAC money, is Cori Bush. Although she's not perfect either. But my point is still, I think she fell into the trap. No question.
No
Okay.
question.
Okay.
No question. No, I don't disagree at all. And that again is that peeling off another layer to turn them against this radical black. That's what it really is. It's a radical black political tradition that survived slavery. It's still here, right? It's just that they're constantly trying to suppress that.
And another element of this, and I'm trying to remember the sister that they did this to in Georgia, Congresswoman. Wait a minute, hang on, time out. Cynthia
McKinney.
The value of having a library.
Yeah.
Cynthia McKinney.
Most definitely.
They did the same thing. How the U.S. creates S-hole countries. Cynthia McKinney. Yeah. They did the same thing to her. So it's not as though they had developed a new strategy.
Right.
It's that it worked against Cynthia, and they played it again, and we let it happen.
Real democracy can immunize these politicians, though, from that kind of strategy.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. You have in chapter 6, the battle on the Bay. You talk about 1927. You talk about this 47-year-old iron worker, John Norris, who buys this flat, and then the depression hits, and he loses everything. You talk about Rose Majeski.
I think I
managed to raise her 5 children. You talk about the Depression. The Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes brought everybody down a peg or two, and the Negro had but few pegs to fall. Travis Dempsey lost his job selling to the Chicago Defender. Then you talk about a gorgeous summer day, Theodore Goodloe driving a truck, and a hayride. Black people on a hayride, and someone falls victim to a white man running into the hayride, and his name was Jon Jeter. John with an H. Yours has no H.
Legally, it does.
Okay. All right. Anyway, so you make a personal, familiar connection to some of this. Elaborate.
My uncle, who was a teenager at the time, I can't remember exactly how old, played in the Negro leagues, actually,
mm-hmm.
Negro baseball leagues, was on this hayride. And I know the street. I'm very familiar with the street. Two trucks can't pass one another. It's just too narrow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like an aqueduct. So it's got walls there to, keep you kind of.
Oh, a viaduct.
Viaduct, I'm sorry. Yeah, not an aqueduct. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Public education. So it basically what happens. My uncle had his legs sort of out the hayride, like he's a teenager, and this car came along, another truck came along, and it sheared his legs off, killed him. I don't think my father ever knew the story. I think my father went to his grave not knowing the story, but we did some research after his death, me and my sister, my brother, my younger brother, and there was almost a riot at the hospital when my uncle died, right? Because I believe, they couldn't quite say it in the black newspaper at the time, but the belief was that this white man had done it intentionally, right? Mm-hmm. He wasn't charged, and black people were very upset. So it was an act of aggression, very similar to like what we see now happening all over the country with these sort of acts of aggression by white men, basically young white men who are angry about, losing feeling they're losing their racial privileges or racial entitlement. And so, anyway, to make the story short, I was named after my uncle. My father and my mother named me after my uncle. But I think it was 1972. I would have been 7 years old. And me and my father were at a farmer's market in Indianapolis, where I grew up. And this old man at this time, doddering, in a brown suit. I'll never forget this, in a brown suit. He comes up to us. And he just comes up to my father and he holds his hand, shakes his hand, and I'm so sorry, and my father said, no, it's okay. You didn't know. It wasn't your fault. Nobody blames you. And come to find out that he was the driver of that hayride, right? I think a dentist at the time. He was the driver of that hayride in which my uncle was killed, and he felt bad about it, I guess, the rest of his days. So, yeah, it's really interesting, one of the sort of that how my life, or at least the lives of my parents and my grandparents, intersects with this story of the class war. And it does in many, many aspects. It does. And I suspect that's true of most people, I hope, who will read the book, that they will find their own lives and their own history intersecting with this class war, because this class war is comprehensive. It's hard to escape from it. It is all about the class war, to paraphrase Fred Hampton. And that story really kind of moved me in a lot of ways, because I have personal history, personal connection.
You mentioned when you just said that there was almost this riot at the hospital. What a lot of people now today don't realize is how many of those incidents occurred during those times, and we know very little, if anything, about them. We were raising hell.
Yes.
So for example, you listen to some kids today who say, man, if I had been back there, I wouldn't have been no slave. I'd have been out there kicking ass and taking names. Well, okay. But implicit in that is a lack of understanding that folks were raising hell. 1898 in Greenwood, South Carolina, one of my great uncles was lynched in the Phoenix riot.
Yeah.
Black people tried to vote. Fight breaks out. White guy gets shot. They round up the usual suspects,
right,
one of whom was my great uncle. Some were lynched, some were shot at the Rehoboth Church, in the parking lot of the Rehoboth Church, nonetheless. Wow. And that was the week before the more famous Wilmington riot.
Right.
It was 1 week before the Wilmington riot. You got the Dockham lunch counters, and I mean, there were all of these. History is replete with all of these stories of our resistance, and somehow now we've lost the near position. We've lost that fight.
We don't understand, and I mean this about all of us, but particularly African Americans. We don't understand. We once were warriors, right? And so one of the things I talk about in the book, I write about in the book, is the Red Summer of 1919. Many people are familiar with 1919, the purges that were going on, basically this industrial upheaval, and the white elites were afraid that blacks were going to sort of lead this union labor organizing movement. And so there were these riots all across the country of whites attacking blacks. But what people don't understand is that the brothers back then, many of them who had participated in World War I, they were like Fred Hampton. It takes two to tango, right?
Right.
And they were shooting back, right?
Yes.
It was, and in fact, to end that thought, some of these riots, which weren't really riots, they were meant to be massacres. Some of these, they had scouts who went into the black community to see like, their vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And a few times, the white scouts came back and said, "No, we don't
know, right?
We better leave them alone."
I was looking over here on my bookcase because I've got. Oh, here we go. Red Summer, the summer of 1919, and the awakening of Black America.
Yeah, I've got that book. I've got that same book. Yeah.
Okay, so and I've got a couple others here. Death in the Promised Land, the Tulsa race riot in 1921. And see, what a lot of people don't know about Tulsa is, after the alleged encounter in the elevator, right? That young man went home. Went to the community, went back to and when the folks came in the community, they didn't just sit idly by and let this deal go down.
Right.
That's why one of the reasons why I think I have this right, that it got to the tension that it did, because it just came an all out fight.
Oh yeah.
We fought back.
Tooth and nail.
We fought back.
Nail. Yeah, no, definitely.
We fought back.
Yeah.
So, Brother Jon Jeter, when someone is done reading Class War in America, how the elites divided the nation by asking, "Are you a worker or are you white?" And I'm reading it backwards. Anyway, what are the three major points that you want someone to take away from reading? And folks, I've read it. It's a phenomenal phenomenal. In fact, before you answer that question, let me give this plug. I suggest that usually when I recommend a book, I try to recommend a complement to it. And I would suggest that people get Jon Jeter, Class War in America, and then get Dr. Ronald Walters, White Nationalism, Black Interests.
Oh, yeah.
And read those two. I
love that. I love being compared to Ron Walters, the late great Ron Walters.
And I would not be where I am and who I am. He played a tremendous role in Dr. Wilmer Leon. I have a PhD because of him.
He's a great man. I interviewed him a few times. Yeah.
So while you're answering that question, I'm gonna. So what are the 2 or 3 things that you want the reader to walk away from this book having a better understanding of?
Well, it almost we almost end where we begin. The first thing is, Fred Hampton, it's a class war. Gee, damn it, is what he said, right? Mm-hmm. It is a class war, but that does not mean that you can put class above race. You can't, if you really want to understand the battle, the fight.
Oh, wait a minute. Let me interrupt you because there was a question I wanted to ask you and I forgot. Thomas Sowell. The economist Thomas Sowell, and just quickly, because to your point about putting class above race, I wanted to get to the Thomas Sowell point, and I almost forgot it. So, in your exposition here, work Thomas Sowell into your answer.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell, and I think a lot of people, particularly now, you see with these young, mostly white liberals, although some blacks like Adolph Reed, the political scientist Adolph Reed, posit that it's class above race. That the racial issues, racial antagonisms should be subordinate to the class issue overall, universal ideas and programs. I would argue you can't parse one from the other, mm-hmm. that they are connected in a way that you can't separate them. That, yes, it is a class issue, but they've used race to weaken the working class, to pit it against itself. And so you can't really you can't really parse the two and understand the battle that we have in front of us, right? The other thing I would say too, because I don't, like the Panthers would say, I hate the oppressor. I don't hate white people, right? And it mm-hmm. really is a white identity. But as George Jackson said, and I quote him in the book, white racism is the biggest barrier to a united left in the United States. That was true when he wrote it. More than 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. It was true 50 years before that. It's true today. It is white racism that is the problem. And once whites can, as we see happening, we do see it happening with these young, many of them Jewish, but really whites above all race, whites of all from all walks of life, are forfeiting their racial privileges to rally to advocate for the Palestinians. And so that's a very good sign that something is stirring within our community. And the third thing I would say is, I'm not optimistic, right? Because optimism is dangerous. Something Barack Obama should have learned, talking about the audacity of hope. He meant optimism, and optimism is not what you need. But I do think there's reason for hope. These young students on the college campuses who are rallying I think the very real existential threat posed to the duopoly by the Democratic Party, by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's complicity in this genocide. I think there's a very real possibility that the duopoly is facing an existential threat. People are understanding that the enemy is our political class, is our elite political class that is responsible for this genocide that we are seeing in real time. Mm-hmm. That's never happened before. So, I would say, the three things: it is a class war. White racism is the biggest barrier to a united left or a united working class in this country. And third, there is reason to hope that we might be able to reorganize. And in fact, history suggests that we will mm-hmm. organize very soon, reorganize very soon. There might be a dark period in between that, but that we will reorganize. And that this time, I hope we understand that we need to fight against this white racism, which unfortunately whites sort of give up that privilege. History has shown whites give up that privilege of being white, work with us, collaborate with us. but they return, as we saw beginning with Ronald Reagan, they return to this idea of a white identity, which is really a scab.
Well, in fact, Dr. King told us in Where We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he said, be wary of the white liberal.
Yeah.
He said, because they are opposed to the brutality of the lash,
Yeah.
but they do not support equality.
Yes.
That was from Where We Go From Here, Chaos. Folks, Jon Jeter, Class War in America, how the elites divide the nation by asking, are you a worker or are you white? After you read that, then get White Nationalism, Black Interests, Conservative Public Policy in the Black Community by my mentor, the late, great Dr. Ronald Walters. And I mentioned the Dockham drugstore protest. Dr. Ron Walters was considered to be the grandfather of the sit-in movement.
Did not know.
The Dockham lunch counter protests in Wichita, Kansas.
Wow.
He helped to organize before the folks in North Carolina took their lead from the lunch counter protests that he helped.
I did not know that.
Yes.
I did not know that.
All right. So now I taught Jon Jeter something today. And now that's a day. That's a day for you. Jon Jeter, my dear brother, I got to thank you as always for joining me today.
Thank you, brother. It's been a pleasure.
Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon, and stay tuned for new episodes every week. Also, please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. You'll find all the links to the show below in the description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. And folks, get this book for the holidays. Get this book. Did I say get the book? Because you need to get the book. We don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you all again next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Y'all have a great one. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.